This all begins with our protagonist who was browsing the internet when he saw an ad that said turn your hobby into big money. Do you love manga and anime? Join us and work will never feel like work again. But that's not all the details. According to the ad, age and education are not an issue, and they even give you free housing. On top of that, the monthly payment is 300,000 yen. This ad obviously caught the protagonist's attention, so he went to check it out. Now the protagonist has to answer a 200-question quiz in 10 minutes. These questions are very difficult, but since the protagonist is a hardcore otaku, he answers all of the questions correctly. The protagonist meets with the head of human resources who is surprised that the protagonist got a perfect score on such a difficult exam. He says the protagonist must be a hardcore otaku. The protagonist says something like that. They ask him just to confirm if it's true that he lived shut in and now lives on his own. The protagonist says that is correct. They also ask why he shut himself in. The protagonist says it's because he was rejected by a childhood female friend. However, this detail only adds more points for the protagonist since the head of HR says it's great such a perfect candidate has come. Anyway, the protagonist asks what their company does, but they tell him he'll have plenty of time to learn that later. For now, they'll make a toast to celebrate. However, they slip something into the protagonist's drink, so it's time to begin the mission. The protagonist starts feeling sleepy while the protagonist is dreaming about the moment when he asks his childhood friend out but was rejected. And yes, she gave him a reason why she rejected him, and everything since she basically rejected him for being an otaku. Poor protagonist. When he wakes up, he wonders where he is and thinks this is too cliché. Just then, he sees a girl dressed as a maid. Seeing the maid, he is excited about what will happen. The protagonist tells the maid she's absolutely perfect, white skin and pigtails and a naturally beautiful face. So the protagonist says if he had to rate the maid, he'd give her 90 points. But if the maid was on a broomstick, he'd give her full points. The maid starts talking to the protagonist, but he doesn't understand anything since the protagonist wonders what language she's speaking. But wait, she shows the protagonist a kind of ring. She wanted the protagonist to put on the ring. Once the protagonist puts on the ring, he can understand everything the maid says. Here, the maid introduces herself. She tells him her name is Miu. She also tells him that starting today, she'll be in charge of catering to his needs. The protagonist wonders why him, and now that he thinks about it, he wonders where the hell he is. Just then, another girl appears out of nowhere and tells him they're in the Ratados forest on the outskirts of Marinos, the capital of the sacred Elden Empire. And the girl who started talking to the protagonist is named Minori. Minori is a first-class soldier of the 1st Division of the Tokyo Self-Defense Forces, and she was assigned as the protagonist's escort. The protagonist is really going to realize he's in another world now. Looking out the window, the protagonist could see a dragon. But there's more. The protagonist could appreciate the sacred palace of Elden, and they tell the protagonist that's where the supreme ruler resides. Hearing this, the protagonist thinks this is like something out of a fantasy novel. So the protagonist asks if he can have a tour, but they say not today since there's someone who will explain everything in detail about his situation. And at that moment, the person arrives. The protagonist encounters the head of HR again, who this time gives him his real business card. Looking at his card, the protagonist sees the guy reports directly to the government. The guy welcomes the protagonist to the other kingdom. They tell the protagonist it all started a year ago when a strange hole was found in the forests. And that hole was like an interdimensional portal, or, for the hood, a portal to the nether, although scholars call it a hyperdimensional passage. Continuing the story, it turns out the hole was a conduit through 3-dimensional space connected to another world on the other side. So when they tried going through the portal, they discovered this world where they are now, noticing there were humans and also very similar cultures to their world, but with some differences. So the protagonist asks if those differences include magic, and the answer is yes. But that's not all. The government sent a research team to establish contact with the governing power. When they succeeded, they reached an agreement and established an alliance with interests from both sides in mind. And this guy's department was formed to facilitate exchanges between Japan and this kingdom. The multimedia entertainment company that interviewed the protagonist is a joint venture between Japan and the sacred Elden Empire. And this is the first company of this kind. So his first idea is to provide all these things to deepen their relationship. The protagonist obviously reacted in surprise. They tell him that watching anime won't be useless after all. But they say that of all Japanese culture, the kingdom responded best to Japanese animation. However, having a government official involved in this kind of thing hasn't yielded good results, especially if they don't know about the topic. Whenever they opened an office, they were forced to close due to mismanagement. So they tell the protagonist he'll basically be living here for a while. but the protagonist says no thanks. He says it's too much responsibility for him. So the protagonist wanted to leave. However, they ask the protagonist if he knows how to get back and the protagonist doesn't know what to say. Minori tells the protagonist not to worry. She says if he gets good results, he'll be free, not to mention he'll be treated like a diplomat in the empire. Also, the protagonist can receive remuneration from the government. So they tell him to just relax and show the people of this place the otaku lifestyle. The protagonist has no other choice, so he ends up accepting. The protagonists discover that Miu, apart from being a maid, is also an elf. Miu nervously tells him she wasn't trying to hide that she's an elf and human, but the protagonist tells her this is totally perfect. The protagonist was thinking not only are you a maid, you're also half-elf, that's awesome. Miu asks the protagonist if he's really not going to punish her for this. With this, the protagonist realizes elves aren't treated very well in this place. However, the protagonist tells her not to worry and the fact that she's half-elf is like a reward for him. The protagonist even took a photo of her ears and everything, and Miu was surprised by the protagonist's cell phone since she had never seen one like it. She asks what it is, and the protagonist tells her it's a kind of magic box. The protagonist also discovers Miu doesn't know how to read or write, so the protagonist is going to teach her a couple of things. Miu is very happy about this. Just then, they heard a noise so Miu said Luke must be back. Miu went to greet him. Hearing about Luke, the protagonist thinks there are more guys here and says that's a bit sad. But when the protagonist sees Luke, it isn't what he expected. Luke's main job is gardening. The next day, it was time for the protagonist to eat. So Miu asks if it was the dining room or eat in bed. The protagonist tells her to go to the dining room. After eating, work time arrived. So they took the protagonist to the palace and Minori tells him he must refrain from overstepping his boundaries. Once they arrive at the palace, they tell the protagonist it's time to see the supreme ruler. And when the protagonist sees the supreme ruler, it turns out she's a loli. The protagonist and his lewd otaku soul can't resist, so he reacts very excitedly. But before entering, they had told the protagonist to behave. So basically Loli didn't like the comment the protagonist made. She got upset and the protagonist got his share of punishment. The supreme ruler was even asking for him to be executed. Meanwhile, the protagonist was internally thinking I have a crazy love for lolis, but luckily for the protagonist, they were able to calm her down since they tell her that in the country the protagonist comes from, you aren't an adult until age 18. So they tell her the protagonist didn't intend to mock her but was simply impressed by her beauty. So the loli decided to forgive the protagonist and internally the protagonist was thinking I have to learn to watch my mouth more. Name of the loli is Anadante, and this guy is her advisor, Sakart. And he's Ascarius, the loli's cousin and knight of noble stature. They were telling her highness that the protagonist is the one who can save her from boredom. But at that moment, Ascarius intervenes and he's thinking I wondered what kind of evangelist would be brought but I see it's just a boy. Garius says someone so young and inexperienced possibly can't know enough about otaku culture to be able to teach the people of this kingdom. So Garius says he can't see the value of the protagonist for this empire. Rather, Garius says the protagonist seems like a poison that once ingested, can't be removed. But the protagonist won't stay quiet. He says well, if applied correctly, even poison can become medicine. The protagonist says he may not be pleasant but making that decision and taking responsibility for it is what makes you an adult. So the protagonist says someone who out of ignorance judges things by calling them poison is the stupidest person. This angered Garius and he already wanted to take him out. But the loli was laughing because she likes the protagonist. She tells him he's funny and she likes him a bit. So she decides the protagonist can have the Amudek company. This way, the protagonist is able to get away after all. The protagonist asks what he should do from now on. They tell him that's a very good question since they don't have the slightest idea. This is because they've been so focused on land preservation and budget that little by little they fell into the habit of not thinking about what they were doing. They also tell the protagonist this will be humanity's first exchange with the kingdom. So the government would like to have a monopoly on this front. But since there's no way to predict the benefits of this company, the budget they've been granted is measly. So what the protagonist must focus on now is selecting products that the people of this world will go crazy over. The protagonist just has to report what he has found interesting, and they'll bring it to this world. The protagonist was about to fall asleep but got thirsty, so he decided to go for water and ran into Miu, who was studying a bit since she told the protagonist she didn't want to waste his kindness. Miu is studying so late because during the day she's busy with work and wants to learn as fast as possible, which is why she studies so late. Hearing Miu wants to learn quickly, the protagonist says he'll help her, but Miu tells him not to waste time on someone like her. However, the protagonist says he's awake anyway so he'll help Miu study. Because of this, during the day the protagonist found material to promote cultural exchange, and at night the protagonist would meet up with Mu, and they would study together. Mu was a student who put in a lot of effort, so this made the protagonist happy. One day the protagonist sets up his otaku studio and says this is what someone would imagine as paradise. Because of otaku culture, both Mu and Luke were surprised. So the protagonist had Mu read manga and put Luke in gamer mode since he was getting addicted to video games. But at that moment, the loli arrived unexpectedly, saying she came to see the protagonist's work in person. The loli says all of this is very strange, so she asks the protagonist if this is the otaku culture he's trying to spread. Just then, she takes a manga, but of course, she can't read it, so she tells the protagonist that this whole otaku culture is right in front of her, but she can't enjoy it. So she asks the protagonist to read aloud for her. The loli orders everyone in the room to leave, but the protagonist realizes he is going to be left alone with the ruler. So he asked Mu to stay too, and she was enjoying the story. She was even hooked, telling the protagonist to hurry up and turn the page. The protagonist asks the Mu if she can read what it says here. Mu tells him yes and that it says man. The protagonist tells her that's correct, it's read the same as her name Mu, but the protagonist says even though they sound the same, they mean different things. The protagonist started praising Mu for her fast progress, but this only upset the loli. She sat on top of the protagonist and ordered him to make her some tea. In the end, the protagonist had to read until the loli was satisfied. That same afternoon, the protagonist was walking when in the darkness he saw some glowing red eyes. So the protagonist started throwing punches in the air. However, it was just Luke behind him. Seeing it was Luke, the protagonist apologizes and asks if he's okay. Luke tells him, yes, he's covered in plants because he was working. The protagonist asks Luke to let him know the next time he's around so he doesn't accidentally hit him. The next day, the protagonist went to see the town on his own since he wanted to see his future clients. The protagonist thinks that if he is going to spread culture, he needs to be accepted by the people. The protagonist realized that many of the store signs were drawings since they told him 80% of the population is illiterate. So the protagonist thinks writing will be useless, and this is a shock to him. But what surprised the protagonist the most was that there were children being trained as soldiers, and the same thing happened with Luke. Luke was in the army and all, and they tell him that Mu is the same case. Luke remembers how they praised her for her offensive magic. At that moment, a bell rang, signaling it was time for those training to take a break. Two kids approach the protagonist, and he asks them what they do for fun. The kids respond that they don't have fun since they say that when they don't have training, they help with the harvest or herd cattle and sheep. The protagonist also asks them if they read books, but they say books are expensive, so only nobles and scholars know how to read and write. Hearing this, the protagonist wonders how they're supposed to enjoy any manga, novels, anime, or anything else he gives them. The protagonist kept spending the evenings reading with the loli. Just then, Mu came in with some tea, but the loli says she didn't ask for tea. However, the protagonist takes this opportunity and tells the loli it's a good time to stop and take a break. However, the ruler didn't want to take a break since she said they were at the best part. But the protagonist tells her he's very thirsty, so he asks her to take a short break, but the loli gets angry and goes after Mu. She tells Mu it's obvious she chose the exact moment to interrupt. But Mu says she didn't mean to interrupt, she just thought her master would need a brief rest soon. However, the loli didn't want to listen, so she kept saying mean things to Mu. She even used the slur mudblood since the loli told Mu she was a mudblood. She was getting carried away since she was about to throw a snack at Mu. But just then, the protagonist stopped her. The protagonist really had an angry face, but he realized the situation was normal for them, so he tried to calm down a bit. The loli asks the protagonist what he's doing to defend Mu. The protagonist tells her he can't stand seeing this anymore since the protagonist tells the loli he was once judged and persecuted. The protagonist says freedom, peace, and equality are the foundation of his culture. So the protagonist tells her if she wants to enjoy his world's culture, she has to understand that. But the loli asks the protagonist if what he calls equality is the name of some philosopher or something similar. So the protagonist realizes she doesn't even know about that concept. The loli tells the protagonist she recognizes his bravery in risking angering her to teach her a lesson. So the loli says she'll forgive them, and neither he nor Mu will be punished. But in exchange, the loli asks the protagonist to teach her his language since it turns out she still can't accept Mu being used for something. One night, the protagonist found Mu crying. It turns out she was crying because of a manga she was reading. It's been almost a month since the protagonist arrived in the Elden Empire and this world. They located an area where they're building a school, and this school is so all the people can learn about Japanese culture. The loli went looking for the protagonist because she wanted to show him she's been practicing his language. The protagonist was impressed by the loli's progress, and since she already has it out for Mew, Loli was thinking as if I'd be surpassed by a maid. The ruler says this is a good opportunity to see who has made more progress. So the ruler takes off the ring, which allows her to understand the protagonist and tries to communicate without the ring. But when the ruler was speaking, she just said nonsense. Here the ruler tells Mew it's her turn now. So Mew takes off the ring and will try to, but Mew also can't do it. Meanwhile, a cult was watching the protagonist, but we'll find out more about them later. The protagonist returns to the usual lessons at the mansion. He's giving classes to a group of about 20 noble children. But the protagonist's hope is that with the school, he can reach other races and classes too. And after classes, they all went home, but the loli stayed with the protagonist. She tells the protagonist she's never met anyone like him before. She says the past evangelists and missionaries always delivered, but obviously only if they were given a reward, and it tended to be for money or fame. So she tells the protagonist it's nice to see he really enjoys what he preaches. The ruler says she's never enjoyed being with someone before. The protagonist responds he's starting to enjoy this world too, and what's left for him to learn about her and Mew. But hearing Mew upset the ruler, so she left angry. Just then, Minori appears and asks the protagonist if he knows what he just did. Minori says this world has a very strong hierarchy, so they don't know freedom and equality. So Minori says they've received approval from the people of this world because they see them as something new and exciting. But Minori says the school the protagonist is building could destroy their entire way of life. The protagonist is aware of this, but he says he's trying to be as prudent as he can. As usual, the protagonist went to give classes to Mew. Just then, Mew asks the protagonist if they could take the rings off for a moment. So they take the rings off, but the protagonist was thinking, I guess you won't be able to understand anything I tell you now. However, the protagonist didn't expect Mew to start speaking his language. She told the protagonist, you are my master, and I am your servant. Now, whatever you order me. After saying that, Mew asks the protagonist, did I say that right? The surprised protagonist tells her she said it correctly. It turns out that when Mew tried the first time since she was in front of the ruler, she had to fake it. The protagonist tells Mew it's incredible and who would have imagined she'd be able to speak his language so quickly. The protagonist tells Mew she's made a big effort. Mew says it's because he's taken the trouble to teach her. Mew also says that besides that, she wants to be able to speak the protagonist's language fluently. The protagonist tells her that's good, and that way she'll be able to enjoy anime with more freedom. But for Mew it's not about that, since here she asks the protagonist that one day when he returns to his country, could he take her too? But internally, the protagonist was thinking, don't let yourself be fooled. This is what you've always fallen for. She only likes your treatment, not you. So the protagonist thought he shouldn't get his hopes up or he might regret it, like what happened with his childhood female friend. 20 days after that, the school was finally finished. So the protagonist was looking at how the school turned out. Mew went with the protagonist and brought him his lunch since he had forgotten it. And just then, the ruler also arrived. Seeing Mew, the ruler asks how far along she is, since Mew says she's finished her second kanji book. So the ruler was with her attitude saying she was above Mew, who should know her place. But the protagonist stands up for Mew and says Mew was busy helping him, which is why Mew has had less time to study. But this angers the ruler, and she throws the book she has at the protagonist. So angry, she tells the protagonist it's always about Mew. She says she gave him permission to start this school and even lent him the troops to build it. So the loli asks the protagonist why he always ignores her for Mew. Upset, the ruler tells Mew she must leave the mansion where the protagonist is living. But here things are going to go bad. Because of those hooded guys I told you about earlier made their appearance, and they took out the soldier who was with the ruler. These guys kidnapped the ruler, and they say they are the Patriot Knights. The Patriot Knights take the protagonist and the others, and they leave the ring for the protagonist and Minori so they don't understand what they're saying. But friends, Mew understands what they're talking about, since it seems they've gotten involved in some plan. Thanks to Minori, they find out these guys have a weapon called the Flame of Extinction, which is a type of magical war weapon. With it, they could even make the school disappear. Thanks to Mew's translations, they also found out the Patriot Knights have an anti-imperialist minority group with no monetary or political power. Just then, these guys grab the protagonist and put the ring on him. Here they ask the protagonist if he is the thief. The protagonist asks what is he guilty of. They tell the protagonist this construction is a symbol of his crime. They say teaching these young humans and non-humans in the same room is outrageous. So they say all this foreign culture of his is the epitome of invasion plans. This guy asks the protagonist why he thinks different races exist, and he answers himself that it's because it pleases God. This guy says elves have strong abilities, but have problems reproducing. On the other hand, he says dwarves have the ability to make fearsome objects but are small and easily swayed by violence. And then he says, lacking these two capabilities but endowed with restraint are humans. He says humans are the race that unifies these humanoids and rules them. But hearing this, the protagonist tells him he has the typical superior race mentality. And he tells this guy the truth is he must just be jealous of elves and dwarves for the power they have. But the guy tells him this culture he's bringing is erasing their ancestors' history. So he tells the protagonist he's basically an invader. But here things are going to go bad, because this guy was planning to execute the protagonist. But thanks to the ruler's words, the protagonist wasn't executed. She said the protagonist worked for Japan and was simply a kind of messenger. So she tells them if they execute him, it would do nothing to Japan. In fact, if they do it, the protagonist would end up being celebrated as a martyr, a messenger of peace who fell victim at the hands of some crooks in his attempt to gain support. So with this, the ruler saved the protagonist. In a moment of carelessness, Minori takes the chance to try to free herself. She has a pen prepared that's actually a weapon to be able to cut the ropes when the time comes. But she tells the protagonist they'll have to find a way out. The protagonist tells her that if she gives him 10 minutes, he'll get them an exit. So at that moment, the protagonist says he has to go to the bathroom. At first, they didn't want to let him go, but the protagonist started making a scene. So finally this guy asked for them to take him out of here. So they took the protagonist to the bathroom. While taking him to the bathroom, the protagonist's cell phone suddenly started ringing out of nowhere, and the guys guarding him didn't know what was happening. But the protagonist is going to take advantage of this and give them a spiel. He tells them not to move and he said the magic words. So the protagonist, in character, says he can finish them off at any moment. And they almost believe the protagonist, but this guy didn't fall for it. However, the time the protagonist gained was enough. Thanks to the time he bought, Minori was able to arrive to help him, and Mew also helped by attacking the enemies with magic. Due to this guy says he has no other option. So he activates the weapon he's carrying. This really worries them since Minori says that once this weapon is activated, it's not supposed to be able to be deactivated. Or at least that's what they thought, since the protagonist easily deactivated it with a fire extinguisher. But here things are going to be able to go bad. Because this guy says that one who listens to the invader doesn't deserve to be the supreme ruler. So this guy attacks the ruler. However, just then Mew jumped in and took the attack for her. This shocks the ruler, and she wonders why Mew did this when she treated her so badly. Mew says she doesn't know, but she simply wanted to believe in the manga the protagonist showed her, which said that one day, different statuses could learn to understand each other. The protagonist went to the hospital to see how Mew is doing, but when he arrived, the doctors say there's nothing they can do for her. So the protagonist thought Mew was gone, but turns out they weren't talking about Mew, but rather about the ruler's pet since Mew is fine. The protagonist encounters the guy who hired him, and he says it seems like he's run into something terrible right after arriving. This guy also tells the protagonist that the cult they encountered appears to be a group of nobles working illegally. The protagonist asks him if he is an invader. His response was that the job they have is to protect the interests of the Japanese government. So the next day, the protagonist couldn't sleep very well, all because of thinking about what they told him yesterday. And today is an important day since it's the school's inauguration. However, the protagonist kept thinking about the words they told him yesterday, that nuances and definitions change depending on your perspective. So they told him that if he believes he's an invader, then he is. Likewise, if he doesn't believe it, then he's not. So they told him not to overthink this and to just focus on spreading the otaku lifestyle. But when the protagonist entered the classroom, he realized the different races were fighting with each other. However, Minori was able to handle the situation very well. She introduced the protagonist as the director and said she was his assistant, and they were both their teachers. A month later, Mew was finally fully recovered, so she was ready to return to work, although there's a lot to do since in this month, Luke didn't exactly clean much. But with Mew's return, the place is going to look like new. Mew asks the protagonist how things are going at the school. The protagonist tells her better than he expected since all his students have a great desire to learn. But Mew tells him it's because he's a good teacher, and Mew tells him that thanks to his help, even she who had no prior preparation learned to read. So for this, Mew tells the protagonist she must be eternally grateful. The protagonist was there, giving his otaku lessons. However, the protagonist was teaching things that were too intense for beginners. Minori told him to let her take over, but she was going to teach them about yaoi. So the protagonist stopped her and said she can't teach them that. So in her second lesson, Minori started talking to them about femboys. On his way home, the protagonist thinks that just showing the students this won't work. He says their values are different from Japan's. So the protagonist says they might actually be imposing their beliefs on them. Just then, an alarm Minori has goes off. So Minori says there's a humanoid nearby. But the protagonist says it's probably just Luke. However, that's not possible since Minori says Luke is registered. So if it was Luke, the alarm wouldn't sound. Minori went to investigate and see what was happening. But when they arrived at the place, they found this waifu. Minori takes the waifu to the mansion to interrogate her. Here the waifu tells them she's an elf woman and says that as they can see, she's a wandering artist. So she has the protagonist take off the ring so the waifu can't understand them talking. And she tells him the fact that she draws doesn't mean she's an artist. Minori says she could easily be a spy. And it turns out something similar has happened to them before. In the past, they've found spies among them several times. Just then, the guards arrive to take away the supposed spy. So the protagonist asks what will happen to her now. Minori says when a spy is found, they're interrogated and punished. The protagonist goes to see the ruler and asks what will happen with yesterday's girl. They tell him there are possibilities that the girl is an agent from the Vagil Kingdom. But they also tell the protagonist it's not like that girl is important for the protagonist's work. However, the protagonist tells them that in fact, she is. The protagonist says drawing has a very fundamental place in otaku culture. So the protagonist says that in order to spread otaku culture in Elden, this girl could be very helpful since having an artist at his disposal would be very useful. However, Garius tells the protagonist he won't be able to work with her since once interrogated, the lady is given a punishment. But the protagonist says he'll prove she's not a spy. So the protagonist starts asking her questions. But in answering, the waifu only makes it worse. The protagonist asked her if she was just drawing as a hobby. She said yes, but also that it's not like she was ordered to depict from all angles places that seem to be secret military bases. So the protagonist can no longer defend her. He says it doesn't matter if she's a spy. And the protagonist was thinking she has animal ears for God's sake. The protagonist is going to use his last card to try to get the girl to stay. So he tells them to let the girl live and let her communicate with the other kingdom like she normally does. The protagonist says that with this girl's help, they could inform the other kingdom only the information they want. And the protagonist says they could even give them false information. The protagonist says this way, they could have the enemy dancing in the palm of their hand. Garius approves this plan of the protagonist's, saying it's truly brilliant. So in the end, the protagonist was able to save the girl. When the protagonist told the girl she wasn't going to be executed and was going to stay with him as his personal artist, the waifu was very happy. The protagonist was amazed by Elvia's drawings, as she portrayed each character just as they were. A few days after taking Elvia as his personal artist, the protagonist had her draw some anime characters as a test. After seeing the drawings, the protagonist concluded she is very good at drawing. The protagonist also discovers this waifu is a werewolf, and as a werewolf, she drew to distract her natural instincts, although she also likes drawing. So it's a win-win. Another new day in which the protagonist will be teaching classes, and today the protagonist would like to talk about the history of beautiful girl video games. So the protagonist tells them that the first game with all female characters was probably released in 1991. And it's believed that was the beginning of it all. So the protagonist shows them a game where a war orphan becomes a princess. The protagonist also shows them a game where you play as a teacher at a fictional high school, and you have to try to straighten out 5 troubled boys. The protagonist kept talking about games, and just then they asked him what his favorite video game is. So the protagonist shows them his favorite game. He even starts playing a bit to demonstrate. The protagonist returns home but realizes Mew isn't there, which seems very odd to him. So he goes looking for her. The protagonist found Mew, who was carrying a ton of clothes, and most of the clothes she was carrying were Elvia's. Mew says it seems when Elvia draws, she ends up very dirty. Hearing this, the protagonist thinks it's nice she's making an effort, but it's also causing Mew more problems. However, Mew says it's fine since she says Elvia is here to help the protagonist with his work. But since it was a lot of clothes Mew was carrying, The protagonist ended up deciding to help her out a bit. Night fell, and it was time for dinner, but the protagonist noticed Elvia wasn't at the table. So he asks where she is, and Minori tells him she's in her room and says she doesn't want to eat. Hearing this, the protagonist finds it a bit strange, so he goes to knock on Elvia's door to ask if she's sure she doesn't want to eat. But since no one answered him, the protagonist entered the room. Once inside, he found Elvia was making a ton of drawings. However, Elvia was very strange. She even threw the protagonist out of her room. The next day, Minori was talking with the protagonist at school and says kids adapt very quickly, so Minori says they'll have to change their lesson plan. However, the protagonist remains pensive, wondering what was up with last night. He couldn't forget the way the wolf waifu was looking at him. When the protagonist arrived to the classroom, he thought the students were fighting, but he realized they were just arguing about video games since each had their preferences over an old video game. I already told you LOL is much better. What are you talking about? Long live .A. Enough guys, don't you realize how childish you're being arguing over these things? It's clear Minecraft is the best game. And finally, when it seemed like they were going to stop, they just started arguing more. When the protagonist returned home, Luke tells him he has an urgent message. Her Highness requires his presence at the castle immediately. So the protagonist was ready to leave, but just then he noticed the wolf waifu was watching him. The protagonist wondered what was going on, so he started imagining things. He thinks Elvia might really be an expert assassin. Once at the palace, the protagonist wonders what this summons could be for, so he wonders if it has anything to do with Elvia. The protagonist met with the ruler, but she was acting weird. She was even telling him she hates him and everything. The protagonist was asking what the problem is, but the ruler just seemed annoyed. So the protagonist asks if he's done something offensive, and in the end the ruler just called him to make a scene. The protagonist was so thoughtful he didn't even pay attention when she asked him something. Miu noticed this, so she tells the protagonist he must be very tired from teaching. The protagonist tells her no, he was just thinking about something and was a bit distracted. In exchange, he asks Miu if something's worrying her. She says it's nothing. However, Miu tells the protagonist here that she thinks he's doing a good job. Miu tells him many things have happened since he arrived here. Miu says he insists on treating her as an equal, and Miu even says she's now friendly with her highness. The protagonist tells her that's all thanks to Miu herself, but she says that's not it, it's all because of him. So she tells the protagonist that with the culture he's spreading, one day people of different statuses will be able to look each other in the eyes. That's what she believes now, Miu says. So in a way, this makes the protagonist a little happy. In exchange, Miu asks the protagonist again if he'll ever return to his country. The protagonist tells her probably yes, but it won't be for very long. Hearing this, the protagonist remembers Miu had already asked him this question. But the first time she asked this question, Miu had told him she wanted to go with him. So the protagonist wonders if she still thinks the same. Here the protagonist asks Miu if he had to return to Japan, would she be willing to go with him? Miu tells him yes. The protagonist was sleeping when he had a nightmare where Elvia attacked him. But when the protagonist woke up, Elvia was very close to him. So the protagonist thought after all he was right, and she wanted to eliminate him. But this was just a misunderstanding. It turns out the wolf waifu is in that time of the month and can't control herself. The waifu says that when the full moon comes, her animal instincts take over all her desires. And that's why this waifu has been acting strange. The video ends here. If you enjoyed the video, like the video and subscribe to the channel.